Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Western Flavors. In our last episode, intensive training began in earnest as Ty faced the brutal reality of rebuilding veterinary skills from the ground up after his catastrophic practice exam failure. Scott drilled him relentlessly on pharmacology protocols for 8 exhausting hours, making information automatic instead of uncertain. Amy took on her first client horse since Willow, a severely traumatized mare named Phoenix who mirrored Amy's own defensive walls, testing whether her healing was real enough to help someone else. Construction reached 50% completion, making Heartland's resurrection feel tangibly possible as the barn framework rose from ashes. And through it all, family became the foundation supporting every struggle. Lisa's wisdom about Jack believing hard things are accomplished through community, not isolation. Lindy's simple faith that her father would succeed if he kept trying. Amy's steady support even while facing her own challenges. The episode ended with the family studying together late into the night, united in their efforts to rebuild careers, heal wounds, and honor the legacy of Jack, Tim, and Marion. If you're enjoying this season, please hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Quick note before we jump in, I've been using NordVPN and NordPass, and they've been game changers for my online security. NordVPN encrypts your connection so no one can track what you're doing online, and NordPass securely manages all your passwords so you don't have to remember dozens of them. If you subscribe through my link in the description, you'll get a huge discount, up to 73% off on a 2-year plan for NordVPN and 53% off on NordPass. Plus, I'll earn a small commission from your purchase, which really helps support Western Flavors. Alright, let's get into it. Today, theory meets practice as Ty faces his first real emergency case since returning. 4 years of absence, weeks of intensive studying, and now the moment of truth. Can his hands remember what his brain has relearned? Amy watches as the man she loves reclaims the identity stolen by 4 years of absence. And sometimes the most important discoveries happen not in classrooms, but in barn surgeries, when muscle memory awakens and proves that some things survive even the longest absences. Tuesday morning arrived with gray skies that matched the nervous energy churning in Ty's stomach. He'd been at Scott's clinic for barely 15 minutes, coffee still steaming in his hand, when Scott's phone rang with the particular urgency that meant emergency rather than routine call. The conversation was brief, Scott's questions direct and professional, his responses clipped. When he hung up, everything about his demeanor had shifted from patient instructor to emergency veterinarian operating under time pressure. Change of plans. Dan Dawson's gelding, severe colic symptoms. I need to assess for possible surgery. You're coming with me. The words landed like cold water over Ty's tentative morning confidence. Real emergency, real horse in real distress. Not another day of drilling pharmacology protocols in the clinic's conference room, but actual field work with life or death stakes.
Scott, I'm not ready for...
You're ready enough. Grab the surgical kit from the supply room. We leave in 2 minutes. There was no room for argument in Scott's tone, no space for Ty to voice the panic rising in his chest or explain that he wasn't prepared for this leap from theory to practice. Scott was already moving, gathering supplies with practiced efficiency, and Ty forced himself to follow instructions despite trembling hands. The drive to Dawson Ranch took 15 minutes along Alberta highways, still damp from overnight rain. Ty spent every second of it fighting the fear that threatened to overwhelm him completely. This was different from observing Scott's routine cases from safe distance, different from drilling theoretical scenarios with textbooks and study guides. This was real veterinary medicine, a real animal in real distress, and Scott expected him to assist with actual surgery if the situation required it. His hands trembled against his thighs. 4 years of absence stood between him and the last time he'd performed emergency surgery. 4 years of nothing, of being no one, of skills lying dormant while the world continued without him. And now Scott was bringing him into the field like he was a competent assistant instead of someone frantically rebuilding capabilities from fragments. Scott glanced at him once during the drive, reading the terror clearly written across Ty's face. Nervous?
Terrified.
Good means you still care about outcomes. But Ty, you've done hundreds of surgeries before. That knowledge doesn't just evaporate. Your muscles remember even when your brain doubts. The reassurance was well-intentioned, but didn't touch the core of Ty's fear. What if his muscles had forgotten? What if 4 years was too long, the gap too wide to bridge? What if he froze under pressure and proved every skeptic right about his inability to practice competently again? They pulled into Dawson Ranch, a property Ty recognized from before his disappearance. He treated horses here multiple times years ago, knew the layout of the barns and paddocks, remembered Dan Dawson as a straightforward rancher who cared deeply about his animals. Dan was waiting anxiously by the main barn now, and his expression shifted dramatically when he saw Ty emerge from Scott's truck alongside the veterinarian he'd called for help. The surprise was immediate and obvious, followed quickly by skepticism that Dan didn't bother hiding. Ty Borden was back in Hudson. Yes, people knew that much. But actually working veterinary cases, that was different from just existing in town, and Dan's face showed clear doubt about Ty's involvement in treating his horse. Ty Borden, you're working with Scott now? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. It asked, are you actually qualified? Can you be trusted? Should I be concerned that you're here?
Assisting. Rebuilding my skills under Scott's supervision.
Dan's expression remained guarded, but the urgency of his horse's condition overrode whatever objections he might have raised. He led them quickly toward the barn, where Rocky, his bay gelding, was clearly in severe distress. Inside the barn, the situation spoke for itself. Rocky pawed violently at the ground, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He kept trying to roll a dangerous behavior during colic that could cause intestinal torsion if there was already displacement. Sweat darkened his coat despite the cool morning, and his breathing came in harsh, labored gasps. Every indicator Ty had learned to recognize years ago screamed surgical emergency. Scott moved immediately into examination mode, his hands efficient and sure as he assessed the gelding. Heart rate check first, fingers finding the facial artery, counting beats against his watch. Then listening for gut sounds with stethoscope pressed against multiple quadrants of Rocky's abdomen, checking mucous membranes for color and capillary refill, watching the horse's behavior for specific pain indicators. The assessment took less than 5 minutes before Scott delivered his verdict. Heart rate's over 70. Complete absence of gut sounds. Severe abdominal pain. This is surgical colic. We need to operate here if he's going to survive. The words sent Ty's heart rate climbing to match Rocky's. Surgical. Here. Now. With him as the only available assistant. They worked quickly to set up a makeshift surgical area in Dan's barn. Scott directed while Ty followed instructions with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Organizing instruments, preparing anesthesia, setting up monitoring equipment. Every movement felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's hands perform tasks his brain could barely process through the fog of fear. Scrub in, you're assisting. Ty wanted to refuse, wanted to say he wasn't ready, that Scott should call another veterinarian, that the risk to Rocky was too high with Ty's uncertain capabilities, but there wasn't time for alternatives. Rocky needed surgery immediately, and Scott needed capable hands to assist whether Ty felt ready or not. So he scrubbed with veterinary soap that smelled achingly familiar, pulled on surgical gloves that felt both foreign and known, positioned himself across the surgical field from Scott, trying to control his breathing as Rocky was anesthetized and prepped for the procedure that would either save his life or prove Ty's incompetence. When Scott made that first incision, Ty forced his trembling hands to function. Retract here. Gently but firmly. Ty positioned the retractors where indicated, his hands shaking visibly as he held them in place. But as Scott worked deeper into the surgical field, something remarkable began happening. The trembling gradually lessened. His hands started moving with increasing sureness, responding to Scott's instructions but also anticipating needs before they were voiced. Muscle memory awakening from its 4-year dormancy. Small intestines twisted. Classic torsion. I need to assess tissue viability before we can correct it. Hold steady there while I rotate the affected section. Ty adjusted his retraction angle without being told, maintaining visualization of the surgical field while Scott carefully manipulated the twisted intestine. His hands knew this work. They remembered the precise pressure needed, the angle that provided optimal access, the subtle adjustments that made the difference between adequate and excellent assistance. The conscious part of his mind was still catching up, still doubting, still afraid. But his hands were operating on knowledge deeper than thought, skills embedded through years of training and practice, surviving intact beneath the surface of his 4-year absence. I need you to assess the distal section while I handle proximal. Check for viability. Tell me what you see. This was a test. Scott was asking Ty to make an independent clinical judgment about tissue that would determine whether they could salvage Rocky's intestine or needed to perform resection. It required skill and experience and confidence, all things Ty had doubted he still possessed. But his hands moved with practiced efficiency, examining the affected intestinal tissue carefully, checking color for signs of adequate blood supply, testing warmth that indicated tissue perfusion, looking for the subtle indicators of necrosis that would require removing damaged sections.
Tissue appears viable. Good pink color. Warm to touch. No obvious signs of necrosis. I think we can salvage without resection.
I agree. Good assessment. Let's correct the torsion and start closure. Those simple words of validation, good assessment sent relief flooding through Ty's chest. His clinical judgment was sound. His skills were functional. He could still do this work that defined him. They worked in synchronized rhythm for over an hour. Scott leading the procedure, Ty assisting with increasing confidence as the surgery progressed, correcting the intestinal torsion, checking thoroughly for other abnormalities, beginning the careful process of closing layer by layer. The trembling in Ty's hands had disappeared entirely, replaced by surgical focus that felt like breathing, natural and automatic. Dan Dawson watched from a respectful distance near the barn entrance, and Ty could feel the man's skepticism gradually shifting as he observed their collaboration. This wasn't Scott working alone while an incompetent assistant fumbled through basic tasks. This was two veterinarians working as a coordinated team, and the competence was visible even to untrained eyes. Halfway through the surgery, movement near the barn entrance caught Ty's peripheral vision. Amy had arrived, standing quietly where she could observe without interfering. She must have sensed his terror that morning when Scott called, must have felt the weight of what this first real case meant to him and his recovery. She'd come to be present for it. Ty couldn't look at her directly. Surgical protocol required his focus to remain on the field, but knowing she was there, watching him work, gave him strength he hadn't known he needed. She would see him as a veterinarian again, see that the man she'd married, the professional she'd fallen in love with, was still present beneath 4 years of absence and doubt. When Scott placed the final sutures and stepped back from the surgical field, the relief was profound. Rocky would recover. The surgery had been successful, and Ty had performed competently throughout, despite 4 years of rust and overwhelming fear. They monitored Rocky carefully as he came out of anesthesia, watching for complications and ensuring stable vital signs. Dan approached once his horse was clearly recovering, his gratitude genuine, but his expression still carrying questions. Thank you both. Rocky's gonna be okay. With proper post-operative care and monitoring, yes, he should make a full recovery. Dan nodded, relief evident, but then he asked the question Ty had known was coming. Ty, are you actually back to veterinary practice? Like really back and ready to work independently? Or is this just you helping Scott occasionally? The directness of the question hung heavy in the barn's quiet. Ty could have deflected with vague answers about considering his options or exploring possibilities, could have overstated his readiness to practice independently, could have downplayed his 4-year absence as if it were insignificant. Instead, he chose complete honesty.
I'm working toward reclaiming my license, doing intensive training with Scott, rebuilding skills after 4 years away from practice. Today was my first real surgical case since I came back. My hands were shaking when we started. I was terrified I'd forgotten everything essential, but the skills are still there. They're rusty and I need more practice before I'm ready to work independently, but the foundation survived.
Dan absorbed this information carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. I appreciate the honesty, and for what it's worth, you did good work today. Rocky's alive because of both of you. It wasn't enthusiastic endorsement or immediate trust, but it was acknowledgement of competence witnessed firsthand. Right now, standing in Dan's barn with surgery successfully completed and honest conversation finished, that acknowledgement felt like victory. The drive back to Scott's clinic was quiet, both men processing what had just occurred. Ty stared at his hands resting in his lap, hands that had just performed surgery, hands that had remembered skills his conscious mind had doubted survived 4 years of dormancy. Scott broke the silence with observation rather than effusive praise. You know what impressed me most today? Not your surgical technique, though that was solid for someone who hasn't operated in 4 years. What impressed me was your honesty with Dan. You could have overstated your readiness or minimized your limitations. Instead, you told him exactly where you are in your recovery. That's the kind of integrity that builds trust in a community. Ty considered this, then explained what had motivated his honesty.
I'm tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be something I'm not yet. If I'm going to rebuild my veterinary practice in Hudson, it has to be founded on truth about my current capabilities rather than false confidence or evasion.
That's mature thinking. Shows you've learned things during your absence that go beyond veterinary skills. He paused at a stoplight, glancing at Ty with something that looked like respect. And for what it's worth, your surgical skills are further along than either of us expected. Your hands do remember. We just need to keep building your confidence through more cases and more practice. I want to bring you on routine calls starting next week. Build your field experience gradually. By the time Ty returned to Fairfield that afternoon, word had already begun spreading through Hudson's tight-knit community. News traveled fast in small towns. Dan Dawson had surely called neighbors, who'd called others, passing along the information that Ty Borden had assisted Scott Cardinal on emergency surgery and the horse had survived. Reactions would vary predictably. Some people impressed, others remaining skeptical, most reserving judgment until they saw more evidence of his restored capabilities. But it was a beginning. The first real proof that Ty could practice veterinary medicine competently despite 4 years of absence. Amy found him on Fairfield's wide porch, sitting in one of the rocking chairs and staring at his hands with an expression somewhere between wonder and disbelief. She sat in the chair beside him without speaking, understanding that he needed time to process whatever revelations the morning had brought. When he finally spoke, his voice carried layers of emotion, relief, and amazement, and something deeper that Amy recognized as rediscovery of identity.
It felt like coming home. When I was standing in that surgery, my hands doing work they haven't done in years, it felt like the veterinarian part of me never actually died, just went dormant, waiting for the right moment to wake up.
Amy reached across the space between their chairs and took one of those hands in hers, the hand that had just helped save Rocky's life through competent surgery.
Skills that define us at a fundamental level live deeper than memory. 4 years of absence couldn't erase what's core to who you are.
They sat together in companionable silence, watching the construction crew work in the distance where Heartland's barn framework stood 60% complete. Everything was rising from ashes simultaneously. The physical structures of their home, Ty's veterinary identity, their family's carefully rebuilt future. All of it progressing through patient, consistent work that sometimes felt impossibly slow but was undeniably moving forward. That evening across town, Caleb knocked on Ashley's apartment door, carrying takeout from Hudson's only decent Chinese restaurant. This had become their routine over the past weeks. Several nights a week he'd arrive with food, and they'd share dinner in her small but comfortable kitchen. The domesticity of it felt more genuinely intimate than the passionate but shallow connection of their young marriage had ever achieved. Ashley greeted him with a kiss that carried the comfortable familiarity of people who'd moved past performance into authentic connection. They settled at her small dining table, the conversation flowing easily as she served food onto plates.
I heard about Ty today. The whole town's talking about his surgery with Scott.
She passed him lo mein with efficient movements, completely at ease in this space she'd created for herself in Hudson.
People are saying mixed things, but the fact that Dan Dawson's horse survived speaks louder than skepticism. That's real proof of competence.
Ty's been working so hard for this, desperate to prove that 4 years didn't destroy who he fundamentally is as a veterinarian.
I understand that desperation on a personal level. When my first consulting venture collapsed years ago, I felt like I'd lost my entire identity, had to rebuild from absolute nothing, and prove I had value beyond being Val Stanton's wealthy daughter with her mother's connections.
She set down her fork, meeting Caleb's eyes with the vulnerability that had been absent from their first marriage.
That rebuilding required persistence through repeated failure. Constant work when quitting would have been exponentially easier, and people who believed in my capabilities even when I couldn't believe in them myself. That's what Ty has with Amy and that family. They refuse to let each other fail.
The conversation shifted naturally into territory they'd been circling for weeks. Caleb asked the question that had been building weight in his chest since Ashley first returned to Hudson.
Are you really staying? Making Hudson permanent rather than temporary?
Ashley's answer came without hesitation or uncertainty.
I love it here, Caleb. My consulting work is actually thriving with remote setup. I have clients across North America now. I have you. I have this community that feels like home in ways Vancouver never did despite years of living there. Coming back reminded me what belonging actually feels like.
She reached across the table, taking his hand with deliberateness that showed this wasn't casual conversation, but significant declaration.
I'm staying, permanently. Building my life here, with you if you want that.
Caleb absorbed this information carefully, processing what her commitment meant for their carefully reconstructed relationship. They'd been building slowly and intentionally, mature approach founded on lessons learned rather than just riding chemistry wherever it led. But permanence required acknowledging fears neither had fully vocalized yet.
I want that, but I'm scared sometimes that I'll revert to old patterns. Shut down emotionally when relationship challenges arise instead of facing them directly. That's what destroyed us the first time.
And I'm terrified I'll become that spoiled, demanding version of myself who made your life miserable through constant criticism and impossible expectations.
But voicing those fears aloud somehow reduced their power. They were building on awareness of past failures rather than unconscious repetition. That consciousness itself represented growth. Later, cleaning up dinner together, moving around Ashley's small kitchen in comfortable coordination, Caleb felt something solidifying in his chest. This was real. This relationship they were carefully reconstructing had substance and foundation. It might actually last this time because they were choosing each other with eyes open instead of just falling thoughtlessly into patterns. At Fairfield that evening, Ty couldn't stop replaying the surgery in his mind, and over dinner with Amy, Lisa, and Lindy, the details tumbled out in a rush of relief and residual amazement. He described the terror when Scott first told him to scrub in, the trembling hands at the procedure's start, the moment his muscle memory activated, and everything began feeling natural instead of foreign. Lindy listened with the wide-eyed enthusiasm of a 10-year-old hearing about her father's heroics. So you saved the horse, like actually saved him from dying?
Scott and I worked together. It was teamwork. But yes, Rocky's going to recover fully.
That's so cool. You're like a superhero but for horses instead of people. The simplicity of her pride made Ty laugh despite the exhaustion settling into his bones. 10-year-olds saw things without the complicated layers adults added to Lindy. Her father had saved a life, and that was purely and simply heroic. Lisa shared updates about construction progress while they ate. 60% complete as of that morning. If weather held and they didn't encounter unexpected complications, Caleb's crew estimated reaching 70% within 2 weeks. The barn was taking recognizable shape now, no longer just skeletal framework but actual building with walls and roofing and structure that suggested the finished product. Amy talked about her afternoon session with Phoenix. The traumatized mare had allowed touch for the first time. Just Amy's hand resting gently on her neck for perhaps 30 seconds before Phoenix moved away. But it was genuine contact instead of defensive aggression, proof that the horse was learning not everyone would hurt her.
She's discovering that trust is possible, even after complete betrayal. That opening yourself to connection doesn't automatically mean being hurt.
The parallel was obvious to everyone at the table. Both Ty and the horse learning to trust themselves again after trauma had destroyed their confidence, taking risks that felt impossible until they actually attempted them and discovered they could survive the vulnerability. They studied together that evening in their usual configuration that had become family ritual. Ty reviewing surgical procedures and post-operative protocols at the large library table. Amy quizzing him on medications and contraindications from textbooks spread across the surface. Lindy doing her homework nearby, her presence more about moral support than active participation, but valued nonetheless. Around 9 o'clock, Ty's phone buzzed with incoming text message from Dan Dawson. The words were simple, but carried weight beyond their brevity. Rocky's doing well, eating normally and moving around his stall. Thanks again for today. You did good work. Validation from someone who'd witnessed his competence firsthand. Recognition that his skills were real and functional, not just theoretical knowledge without practical application. Ty showed the message to Amy, and she squeezed his shoulder with pride that needed no words. Late that night, after Lindy had gone to bed and the house had settled into the particular quiet that comes after midnight, Ty found himself unable to sleep despite physical exhaustion. His mind kept replaying the surgery, not with anxiety anymore, but with something closer to wonder. He walked to the library where he'd spent countless late nights studying and found Amy already there, reading by soft lamplight. She looked up when he entered, set down her book without marking her place, and patted the couch cushion beside her in wordless invitation. Ty sat, and Amy took his hand, waiting patiently for him to find words for whatever was keeping him awake. The words came slowly at first, halting and uncertain, then faster as emotion broke through carefully maintained composure.
I was terrified when Scott told me to scrub in. Genuinely terrified that my hands would freeze, that 4 years had destroyed something essential about who I am, that I'd fail publicly and spectacularly, and prove every person right who doubted I could ever practice veterinary medicine competently again.
He paused, staring at their joined hands.
But my hands didn't freeze. They remembered. And standing there in that surgery doing work I love, it felt like the veterinarian part of me, The absolute core of my identity never actually died during those 4 years. It just went dormant, waiting for the right conditions to wake up and function again.
Amy squeezed his hand, tears gathering in her eyes as she absorbed the significance of what he was describing.
I saw that today. When I watched you work with Scott, I saw the man I married. The veterinarian who's brilliant under pressure, who loves helping animals, not because he's good at it, but because it's genuinely who he is at his core. That person never left. He was just buried under trauma and doubt and fear.
Ty acknowledged that fear had been the heaviest burden he'd carried since returning. Fear that he'd never be competent again, that he'd lost too much time, that the gap was too wide to bridge. But today had given him concrete evidence to stand on. Not just theoretical hope, but real proof that his foundation had survived intact.
My surgical instincts, my ability to assess tissue and make clinical judgments, my veterinary identity itself, all of it's still there. Rusty and requiring practice, but fundamentally solid.
They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, processing what one successful surgery meant in the larger context of Ty's recovery. It didn't mean he was fully ready for independent practice. There was still significant work ahead with more cases needed, more confidence building required, eventual licensing exam to pass. But today had proven something crucial that neither of them had been entirely certain was true. Recovery was genuinely possible, not just desperate hope or wishful thinking.
Scott wants to bring you on more cases?
Ty nodded, a small smile finally touching his features.
And you have all of us supporting you through every step. Scott training you with professional expertise. Me believing in you without reservation. Lindy's absolute faith that you can do anything. Lisa's steady presence. Caleb's friendship. You're not fighting this battle isolated and alone.
That support is what makes recovery possible. If I was attempting this rebuilding in complete isolation, I would have given up weeks ago when the failures felt overwhelming. But knowing my family is fighting alongside me, refusing to let me quit, that transforms impossible into achievable.
Through the library window, the Alberta night stretched vast and infinite, stars brilliant in the absence of light pollution. Somewhere in that darkness, Heartland's framework stood 60% complete, another structure rising from devastation through patient consistent work. Tomorrow, it would be incrementally more finished. Tomorrow, Ty would continue rebuilding his veterinary identity case by case. Tomorrow, Phoenix might allow Amy to touch her for a few seconds longer. Tomorrow would bring small, almost imperceptible progress on multiple fronts. But tonight, this quiet moment of sitting together in lamplight, processing the reality that Ty's veterinary identity had survived 4 years of dormancy and was genuinely recovering, this was enough. More than enough. This was everything that mattered. This was hope transformed from desperate wish into tangible reality through competence demonstrated and skills proven functional. This was the beginning of Ty Borden truly coming home to himself. That concludes today's episode of Heartland. Ty faced his first real emergency case since returning, when Scott brought him on complex colic surgery at Dawson Ranch, and his hands trembled initially, but muscle memory gradually awakened, proving that 4 years of absence hadn't destroyed the foundation of his surgical skills. They'd merely been dormant, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Amy watched proudly as Ty worked with increasing competence and focus, seeing the veterinarian she'd fallen in love with, reclaiming his identity piece by piece through the simple but profound act of doing work he loved. The successful surgery spread word through Hudson that Ty Borden was actively practicing veterinary medicine again, sparking predictably mixed community reactions ranging from impressed to skeptical. Dan Dawson's direct question about Ty's status led to honest acknowledgement of his journey, rebuilding skills after 4 years of absence, not yet ready for independent practice, but clearly competent and steadily improving through intensive training. Meanwhile, Caleb and Ashley's relationship deepened through domestic normalcy as they discussed her permanent move to Hudson and their mature approach to building something real this time, founded on awareness of past failures rather than just chemistry. The episode ended with Ty and Amy processing the day's significance in their library late at night, Ty realizing that his veterinary identity had survived dormant rather than destroyed, that skills defining us at fundamental levels live deeper than conscious memory can touch, and that today's successful surgery proved his foundation was solid even if complete rebuilding would require more time and patient, consistent work. Join us next time when Ashley officially settles into Hudson permanently, and the community begins accepting her presence as lasting rather than temporary. When Ty handles more veterinary cases with Scott, building confidence through repeated successful treatments, when Amy's work with Phoenix continues revealing uncomfortable truths about her own unfinished healing journey, and when construction progress brings renewed hope, even as background news reports begin mentioning Alberta's concerning drought conditions. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. Until next time, this is Western Flavors.